Hello, everyone. So as I said yesterday on the IB Economics Facebook group, I see almost every week some questions about protectionism, about tariffs, quotas, and how, especially how you can use diagrams to illustrate these two ways you can protect your domestic economy. And so yeah, I felt like this could be useful to spend some time explaining it all. I believe I have one approach that makes it easy to understand. Again, I think it's terrible if students remember the diagrams without really understanding them, especially because they might be a bit complicated uh, and not very solid in terms of building some knowledge for the exam and for the future. So, okay, here we go. Let's have a look at tariffs first, and then we'll look at quotas. So I'll start by showing what happens when there is a no trade equilibrium. So when you have like one closed economy, then I will open the economy to international trade, and so see the case where there is no tariffs, no quotas. And finally, we'll look at the case of an open economy with after the introduction of tariffs and after the introduction of a quota. We'll see the consequences that this has on domestic production and employment, on the equilibrium price. And we'll also have a look at changes in surpluses, consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, and the existence of a deadweight loss, because you know that both tariffs and quotas create a deadweight loss. So we'll try to use these diagrams to well, see where they are. Okay, let me share my screen. So that's actually this is actually a PPT that I use for AP, because I never taught IB. I'm in the IB group, but I've never taught IB economics. But well, for protectionism, barriers to trade, I guess the AP curriculum and the IB curriculum are quite similar. Okay, let's have a look at that. So yeah, I'm gonna skip the beginning where I discuss what protectionism is about. Okay, so we want to protect our domestic industries from foreign competition. So there are several possible reasons, but you know that. So I'll just let you have a look at the PPT. And of course, there are two main instruments, two main tools that government can use to implement this type of protectionism, tariffs and quotas. So tariffs are simply taxes on imports, and quotas, it's a maximum amount of imports that we are allowed to buy from foreign companies, basically. Okay, so tariffs, taxes on imports. Again, the objective is to make foreign products more expensive, so less internationally competitive. So the quantity demanded should decrease. That's all. Yeah, so they are less competitive compared to domestic products. Okay, so the objective is to stimulate domestic production, and at the end of the day, this is one way to decrease unemployment in our country. Well, this is what is expected, but there will be a deadweight loss created by the introduction of a tariff, and this can spark trade wars. We, of course, have a recent example with the China-US trade war. Okay, and one advantage of tariffs, especially if we compare them against quotas, is that tariffs, they generate extra tax revenue for the government. In the European Union, this is a major source of income. Okay, so same thing. Let's start with the no trade equilibrium. So no trade equilibrium, this is where you basically have a closed economy that has no connection with the rest of the world. Okay, you can call that the North Korea case, even if even North Korea imports and exports some things. It exports services, for example. You know that there are restaurants in China that are actually run by North Korean businesses. or by the North Korean government. And of course, North Korea does import many products, especially from China. So it's not even a good example. So let's just imagine this theoretical example of a country that does not have any relationship with the rest of the world. So you have SD is for domestic supply. So the quantity produced by domestic companies, and DD, this is not the taxi service, this is the domestic demand. So that could be, so I don't know in what market we are, right? But it could be by households, for example. If this is a consumer good, this is going to be the demand from or by households. Okay, so of course, if there is no trade, supply, domestic supply is equal to domestic demand, boom, PNT for no trade is the equilibrium price, and QNT is the equilibrium quantity traded when there is no trade. Okay, now let's open this country to the rest of the world. Okay, and of course, apart from domestic companies, there are many companies abroad that produce the same product. So what we can represent here, this horizontal line, SF, is a foreign supply. And the first thing that I want to explain is why it is horizontal. Why basically you have a foreign supply of the product that is perfectly price elastic at some level. Okay, I haven't given a name, but we can say P1. And actually, I always find it a bit tough for students to understand that. So what I like to do is, instead of just showing this horizontal line, I like to show what happens to this foreign supply when the price is either above. Let's give it a name. Let's call this one okay, P1, for example, P1, because we may think, and we would be mistaken, we may think that this is the only possible price. No, of course, there is a certain quantity supplied by foreign companies at any price. Okay, so what happens when it is below P1? Well, what you and your students have to understand is that the foreign supply is actually zero. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, it would be there. Let me try to use black, so it's the same color. Don't know if the size is going to be okay. Okay, we guess. So you see, the foreign supply would actually be zero below this world price. And if the price is above P1, the foreign supply would actually be equal to the total foreign supply. So this would be something huge. This would not be something infinite, but basically you could continue this horizontal line very far, and then eventually you would have something, the foreign supply would become upward sloping again, but at a very large quantity. It is so large that it is just not relevant, so we usually don't include it. So why do we have this shape? Simply because if the price is below P1, which is going to be the equilibrium world price, no foreign company will be willing to sell the product to me. And instead, they will sell the product to other countries. Okay, we have to understand that in this model, we are one small country among thousands of other countries. Okay, there are many potential buyers of these goods and services produced by foreign companies. So again, if the price that I offer to purchase this good from foreign companies is below P1, below the world price, no company will be willing to sell this product to me, to my country, and therefore the supply will be equal to zero below P1. On the other hand, if my country, let's put it this way, if my country offers a price above P1, above the world price for that product, then in this case, we would have all companies abroad, all the companies in the rest of the world who are producing this particular product, who would like to sell their output to me. So that's why in this case, the foreign supply would be perhaps not infinite, perhaps in theory, but very large. And again, this is so large that the quantity is irrelevant for me. So that's why we do not represent this upward sloping section that would exist at a very high level of output. Okay. So basically below P1, the foreign supply is 0. Above P1, it is equal to a very large quantity. So that's why we typically represent the world supply or the foreign supply as a perfectly price elastic supply curve, perfectly price elastic at P1. That is going to be the world price. Okay, so I think it's important to explain that to your students, to explain why this is the case. Why do we have a world price? Why do we have a foreign supply that is represented by a horizontal line? Okay, let's move on. Let me delete that. Good. So now that we have the domestic supply, and now that we have the foreign supply, I can build the total supply. And the total supply is simply the sum of the domestic supply and the foreign supply. So basically what I got to do is to say, all right, we look at different prices and we just sum the foreign supply and the domestic supply. It's actually a horizontal sum that we do. So, and as you can see, for every price below P1, okay, the foreign supply is 0. So the total supply is simply equal to the domestic supply. Okay, no firm abroad wants to sell the product to me in my country. So the foreign supply is 0. So the total supply is simply the domestic supply. Okay, so that's why basically the total supply, what you have in green here, is the same as domestic supply for any price below P1. Okay, then what happens above P1 is that the foreign supply becomes very, very large, as I explained earlier. So the total supply would be very, very, very large again. So we don't represent it. We don't represent it because this is an irrelevant range of output. So we simply represent the horizontal section there just to recognize the fact that if I am willing, if my country is willing to offer the world price, what I labeled P1, then basically the total supply is potentially infinite. Okay, I can basically find as many sellers as I want, mostly from the rest of the world, to purchase this particular product. Okay, so I hope you understand that this total supply that I have simply labeled S is the sum of the domestic supply represented by this red line and the foreign supply represented by this black horizontal line. Okay, so now what we can do is to find where is going to be the equilibrium. So again, you see, I have not yet introduced a tariff. I've simply opened the economy to international trade. Well, again, the equilibrium now is going to be where the total supply is equal to the total demand, but here the total demand is simply the domestic demand. Okay, so total supply, that is my green curve or combination of lines. My domestic demand, this is still represented by this blue line. So the new equilibrium, it's there. Okay, supply is equal to demand, total supply is equal to demand. So we have an equilibrium price P1T, so T is for trade, not tariff, and the equilibrium quantity Q1T. Okay, good. So that's the trade equilibrium, but there is no tariff yet. So we could see if we compare, I don't know if I did the comparison. Oh, by the way, this quantity Q1D is the quantity that is supplied by domestic companies. How do I know that? Well, I just have to look at if the price is P1T, how many units of output will my domestic companies be willing to produce? Okay, so I start from P1D and I meet the domestic supply curve and I read the corresponding quantity. So at that price, my domestic companies, they will supply Q1D and the rest is going to be imported. Okay, the equilibrium quantity is Q1T, domestic firms supply Q1D, so the rest is going to be imported from firms abroad. Okay, so this represent imports. Okay, good. Have I made the comparison? All right, we could even see the consumer surplus. So of course, the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. Okay, so below the demand curve and above the price. So that is going to be the consumer surplus. This is going to be the producer surplus. Okay, producer surplus. This really represents the surplus of domestic firms here, right? When we talk about surplus in this type of producer surplus in this type of model, we are here talking about the surplus of domestic companies. So again, the producer surplus is the area below the price and above the domestic supply. Okay, and if I add all this, I could get the total surplus, but it doesn't matter for now. Okay, should be good, hopefully. Now, what happens when we introduce a tariff? What happens when we introduce a tax on imports? So in this case, so again, we have the initial foreign supply. This is the same as before, no problem. But now let's introduce a tariff, and a tariff is simply a tax. And you know that whenever we introduce a tax, an indirect tax, if you want, in a particular market, this is going to lead to an upward shift of the supply curve. Be careful, the shift should really be upward and not leftward. So that's going to be an upward shift of the foreign supply, not domestic, of course, because the tariff only is only imposed on goods and services that were produced abroad. So the domestic supply curve is not going to change at all. It's only the foreign supply curve that is going to shift upward by an amount exactly equal to the amount of the tariff, the per unit tariff. Okay, boom. So SF plus T, that's basically my new foreign supply. Okay, so same thing, any price below this one would be such that the quantity supplied by foreign companies will be 0. And above this price, the quantity supplied would be potentially infinite or very, very large. And again, at that price, basically, we assume that I could find as many sellers as I want if I am willing to offer this particular price there. Okay, so same thing, and then we exactly do the same thing as before. First thing to do is to build the total supply curve, the sum of the domestic supply and the foreign supply. So same thing, for any price below this one there, I hope you see my clicker. Any price below this one, the foreign supply is 0. So in this case, the total supply is simply the domestic supply. So it's going to be the same as the red curve. And again, if I am willing to offer this particular price there, I could find as many sellers as I wanted. Okay, so the total supply would basically become perfectly price elastic at this level. And again, above P1, above this price there, I had not given a name to this one. Above that price, the total supply would be potentially infinite, simply because all sellers abroad, they would like to sell their output to me, to my country. Okay, so same thing, I can build a total supply that would pretty much have this shape. Okay, so you see it's the same as the domestic supply below this price here, because foreign supply is 0, and then it becomes perfectly price elastic at this price, at this price level, if you want. Okay, and same thing, now we find the equilibrium where total supply is equal to total demand. Total demand is against only the domestic demand here. Total supply, that's my green combination of lines. So this is going to be the equilibrium, this price P2T, and this quantity Q2T, all right? Well, we'll compare with what happened before, okay? Same thing, it's important for you to be able to identify how much will be produced at home and how much will be imported. So in order to find that, you start from P2T, and you say, all right, so at that price, how many units are my domestic companies willing to supply? So, okay, so you meet the supply curve up over there, and then you read the corresponding quantity. So D2 is the quantity supplied by domestic firms, produced by my domestic firms after the introduction of the tariff. Okay, so supplied domestically. And of course, the total, the equilibrium quantity is larger. So we are simply, my country is simply going to import what's left. Okay, so the gap between Q2T and Q2D is going to be what we import. All right. Good, so now same thing, we can identify the the consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve, the producer surplus, the area below the price and above the domestic supply curve. And we can also, or haven't yet done it, we can also identify the revenue. We'll see that later. Okay, so now let's just focus on consumer surplus and producer surplus after the introduction of the tariff. Now, what is interesting, and that's really, that's usually where students and perhaps some of us struggle, is when we compare the situation before the tariff and after the tariff. So I have overlapped the two diagrams, and this is what we get. So remember, let me just summarize. So Q1 is basically, Q1 P1 is basically what we had before the introduction of the tariff, and Q2 P2 is what we have after the introduction of the tariff. Okay, so let's try. So of course, we can see that overall, the consequence of the introduction of the tariff is a reduction in the total output that is traded. Okay, before the tariff was imposed, we used to trade QT1. Now we trade QT2. Okay, so there is a lower output and there is a higher price. Before the introduction of the tariff, the price was P1T. After the introduction of the tariff, the price is P2T. So higher price. So lower quantity and higher price. Well, as you can imagine, it's not good for consumers. Yeah, consumer surplus is going to decrease. Yeah, this we know. Okay, so lower output and all increase in domestic production. So yeah, that's the main objective of the tariff. Before the tariff was introduced, domestic companies only produced QD1 and now they produce QD2. Why? Simply because the price is higher, so firms are given more incentives to produce. Okay, that makes sense. And more domestic production, and the consequence is also less imports. Remember, initially, before the tariff was introduced, we imported QT1 minus QD1. Okay, so basically this horizontal distance. Okay, and now after the introduction of the tariff, we only import QT2 minus QD2. Okay, so basically this horizontal distance there between, yeah. So you see it's lower, and the decrease in import can be represented by this plus this. Okay, so this arrow plus this arrow, this represent the decrease in imports. Okay, so to summarize, when we introduce a tariff, there will be less overall. The equilibrium output will decrease, the equilibrium price will increase, there will be more domestic production, and there will be less imports. Okay, I guess that's a good way to summarize everything, and I hope you understand that on the diagram. Okay, now let's try to compare what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and all. All right, so this is where it gets tricky. Pay attention. So, and I'll try not to make mistakes myself. I haven't done that in a long time. So initially, before the tariff was introduced, the consumer surplus was this big triangle. Okay, this big triangle there. After the tariff is introduced, it's only the top triangle. Okay, so we see that consumer surplus has decreased. This blue shaded area is the decrease in consumer surplus. What consumers have lost, surplus lost. A delta negative means it's a loss. Okay, that's usually how I write it. But let's try to analyze that a bit more precisely to see what has happened to this surplus. Is this lost to everyone, or is this just a transfer from one to the other? Well, when we look at things a bit more precisely, we see that this green shaded area is consumer surplus that was lost, yes, but not lost to everyone. It's simply consumer surplus that was transferred or taken, if you want, by businesses, by domestic companies. It used to be consumer surplus. Now, after the introduction of the tariff, it is producer surplus. Okay, remember that before the tariff was introduced, producer surplus was this area over there. Okay, and after the tariff is introduced, because the price is higher and the quantity produced by domestic firms is higher too, producer surplus will increase. Basically what happens is that they take some of the former consumer surplus. Okay, so this green area is consumer surplus that goes to producers. So that's why this is not going to be part of the deadweight loss, because it's not lost to everyone. It's just lost by consumers, but gained by producers. Okay. Now, what about this area? This area is actually, it used to be consumer surplus. Okay, it's no longer consumer surplus, but again, it's not lost to everyone. This area actually represents the tariff revenue. Okay, so the amount of money that has been collected by the government through the introduction of this tariff. How do I know that? Of course, the tariff revenue is equal to the tariff rate, or the tax rate, if you want, which is given by the vertical distance between these two supply curve. Okay, so between SF and SF plus T, that's the rate of the tariff, the tax rate, if you want, times the quantity that is imported after the tariff is introduced. Okay, and the quantity that is imported after the tariff is introduced is QT2 minus QD2. Okay, so that's why this rectangle is the tariff revenue. So again, this is not something that is lost. It's lost surplus for consumers, but it's something that is gained by the government. So that's why this is not part of the deadweight loss. Okay. So what's left? Because if you remember, this is what consumers have lost. This area has been gained by firms. This area has been gained by the government. But you see that there are two small triangles, which used to be consumer surplus. This has been lost by consumers, and this has not been, let's say, received or taken by anyone else, not by domestic businesses, not by the government, not even by foreign companies, okay? This is just lost to everyone. That's why we say that these two triangles represent the deadweight loss that is generated or created by the tariff. Okay. And that's it already. That's it. So now let's do the same thing with quotas. And it's going to be very similar, very, very similar. So this should be much quicker. So what is a quota? Okay, it's a limit on the quantity of the good that can be imported. Yeah, so import quotas and tariffs have similar consequences. So the objective is to reduce imports and to stimulate domestic production. And again, we'll see that this leads to, this creates a deadweight loss. Okay, essentially the same. But something that is perhaps not good for government is that this does not generate revenue. Okay, so same thing. So this is the no trade equilibrium. That's the same as before. This is the trade equilibrium with no import quotas, same as before. Remember that this is the quantity supplied domestically, QD1. QT1 is the total quantity that is traded in this market. But again, this is the case of an open economy, but with no quota, no import quota. So we can import as much as we want. Okay. Now, where it gets interesting is what happens when we introduce the quota. And actually, okay, so consumer surplus, producer surplus, the same as before. When we introduce an import quota, the foreign supply is going to change. So remember that basically it has this shape. It was just perfectly elastic because there were no limits on the maximum quantity that we could buy from firms abroad. So that's why it was just horizontal, and it would never end, or at a very, very large quantity perhaps. But when you have an import quota, this is going to be the shape of your foreign supply. So let me explain. So again, this is the same price as before. You see that this is the same height. Okay, this is still PYT. Perhaps I should have added it. Let me add it. So this is still P1T. Okay, same here, same price. So again, as was the case before, if I offer a price, if my country offers a price below P1T, no firm abroad will be willing to sell anything to me. So the foreign supply is going to be equal to 0. And as long as I offer, let's say, P1 and above, then of course everyone would like, all firms abroad would like to sell the product to me. But the problem is that the maximum quantity that they can sell to me, so the maximum quantity we can import, is limited by a quota. So in this case, the quota, I wrote it QF upper bar. Upper bar is usually for maximum quantity, which means that above P1T, the foreign supply is always QF upper bar. Okay, because of course the firms abroad, they want to sell as much as they can for any price to me. They want to sell to me as much output as they want. So basically the quota is binding, which means that it is active. It's not firms abroad, they sell as much as is allowed by the quota. So then it doesn't matter if the price is P1 plus 2, P1 plus 3, P1 plus 4, in all cases, the quantity supplied by firms abroad will be equal to the quota. They want to sell to me as much as possible. And again, at P1 exactly, then basically we assume that the supply is perfectly elastic, which means that this could be any quantity between 0 and the maximum quantity QF upper bar. So again, now that I have that, now that I understand the shape of this foreign supply curve after the introduction of this quota, I can calculate, or I can draw the total supply curve, okay? Which is going to be the domestic supply plus the foreign supply. And again, below P1T, the foreign supply is 0. So the total supply is the same as the domestic supply. So I can expect that below P1T, the total supply is just going to be equal to the domestic supply. But for any price above P1, the domestic supply, sorry, the foreign supply is equal to the quota, okay, the maximum quantity that I can import. So basically it means that the total supply will be equal to the domestic supply plus this fixed quantity. Okay, which means that above P1, the total supply is simply going to be the domestic supply plus a fixed quantity. So it's like if you shift your domestic supply to the right by a quantity that is equal to the quota that is fixed by the government. So overall, this is what's gonna happen up. So you see, below P1, total supply is just domestic supply. And then at P1 and above, the total supply is just the domestic supply plus the import quota. Okay. So again, this green, I don't know how to trend or line or curve, I don't know, is my total supply. And again, now what I must do is to find the equilibrium after the import quota is introduced, which is going to be when total supply is equal to domestic demand, as was the case before. And boom, that's it. Quantity QT2 and price PT2. We'll compare in a minute. Okay, so that's the trade equilibrium with the import quota. So same thing, let's try to see what happens. And I could identify, again, the quantity that is going to be produced at home. So I always do the same thing, same method. I start from the equilibrium price, PT2, and I ask myself, okay, if the price is PT2, how many units will domestic firms be willing to produce? Okay, I have the answer by looking at the domestic supply. So it's going to be QT2. And then I see that overall the quantity traded is QT2. So how much we will import? It's going to be, okay, so it's going to be supplied domestically, QD2, and what is imported is QT2 minus QD2, which is exactly equal to the import quota, which makes sense because we see that the price, the equilibrium price is above the P1T, above the world price, which means that firms abroad, they want to sell as much as possible to me. So they will, the quantity that they will supply and that we will effectively import is going to be equal to the maximum amount that is authorized by the government, the import quota. Okay, we could look at the consumer surplus. So same thing, the consumer surplus is simply the area below the demand curve and above the price. The producer surplus, so careful here, the producer surplus, same thing as before. It's the area below the price and above the supply curve. So remember, of course, we only look at the quantity that is supplied domestically, right? Of course. Okay. And let's do the same thing as before. Let's compare what happens before the quota is imposed and after the quota is imposed. So same thing, I have overlapped the two diagrams. So remember that The superscript 1 stands for what happens before the introduction of the quota, and the superscript 2 means shows what happens after the introduction of the quota. T stands for total, D stands for domestic. Okay, right. So let's see what happens. So overall, we see that the overall quantity traded has decreased and the price has increased, just exactly like when we had a tariff, right? So there is a decrease in the total output that is traded in this market from QT1 to QT2. And at the same time, there is an increase in price from PT1 to PT2. Okay, so as was the case before, this means that this is not good for consumers. We'll see that in a minute. Domestic production increases. That's one of the objectives of introducing an import quota. It increases from QD1 to QD2, again, simply because the price is higher. So domestic firms have a higher incentive to produce. And imports will decrease. Again, same thing. We used, before the introduction of the import quota, we used to import QT1 minus QD1. So this was basically this horizontal distance there. And after the introduction of the import quota, we only import QT2 minus QD2. So this horizontal distance there. So we see that this red arrow plus this red arrow actually represent the overall decrease in imports that is made possible through the introduction of the import quota. All right, now let's talk about surplus. Again, so the consumer surplus before the introduction of the quota was this big triangle, okay? After the introduction of the import quota is the smaller upper triangle. So we see that after we have introduced the import quota, consumer surplus have decreased by this amount, okay? So this blue shaded area is the loss of consumer surplus. And again, what we can do is to analyze where does it go? Does it go to domestic firms? Does it go to the government? Does it go, where does it go, basically, to identify whether or not there is a deadweight loss. Okay, so first we see that this area there is basically shows the increase in domestic producer surplus, right? Remember that before the import quota was introduced, the producer surplus was represented by this area, okay? After the import quota is introduced, the price is higher and domestic firms, they supply more. So producer surplus is going to increase, and it increases actually by this green shaded area. It used to be consumer surplus. It used to belong to consumers. And basically what the introduction of the import quota has caused is a transfer from consumer surplus or from consumers to producers. Okay, so this is not a surplus that is lost to everyone, simply a transfer from consumers to producers. And you see that I have added PSD for domestic producer surplus because there will be something interesting about the surplus of firms abroad. Okay, now, second thing, we see that this area, this one is interesting. This area used to be part of consumer surplus, okay, before the introduction of the tariff, okay, this is everything that is lost, all the consumer surplus lost. So this area is a fraction of it. And where it actually goes, it goes to firms, it becomes producer surplus, but not producer surplus of domestic firms, but producer surplus of foreign companies. Why is that? Okay, let me explain. So first we have to remember that after the introduction of the import quota, the amount that is going to be imported from foreign companies is equal to QT2 minus QD2. Okay, so this horizontal distance there is indeed the quantity that we import. And what you must know is that the world price is P1T. Okay, remember that the world price initially is P or PT1. Okay, so this represents the world price. This represents the foreign supply. This represents the minimum willingness to accept, the minimum price that foreign businesses must accept to sell one unit to me. And the thing is that they don't only receive PT1, this minimum price. When they sell one unit to me, they receive PT2, this higher price. So the vertical distance there between PT1 and PT2 is actually surplus for producers abroad, for foreign producers. The difference between the price that they actually receive, PT2, and the minimum price that they would have been willing to accept to sell a unit to me, the world price, PT1. So again, this rectangle, this rose, like my beautiful time, this rose rectangle is not a surplus that is lost to everyone. This is lost for consumers, but this is gained by foreign companies in the form of extra producer surplus. So, okay, we see that this green shaded area is just a transfer from consumers to domestic companies. The rose shaded area is a transfer from consumers to foreign companies. But you see, we still have these two triangles, just like in the case of tariff, which again used to belong to, that used to be part of consumer surplus, but that is just lost to everyone. It has not been collected by domestic companies. It has not been collected by foreign companies, and of course, it has not been collected or by the government, because there is no tax in this case. So these two triangles, they simply represent the deadweight loss that is created by the introduction of this import quota. And I think that's it. Yeah, and you see that's the last module in AP macroeconomics. All right, so of course, I like my diagrams because I made them. So I don't know if they are the best. At least they are the best for me. I don't know if they are the best for you guys, but I feel like this is quite clear. I feel like in many textbooks, the diagrams are not so clear. So again, I never taught IB, so I don't know. I hope the diagrams are good in IB textbooks, and I trust they are. But I think this approach makes sense, and students seem to understand it well, especially this step where we build the total supply, okay, where we really explain that the total supply is just the domestic supply plus the foreign supply. When we build this green total supply curve, when we find the equilibrium, I think it helps. And then I think, again, the analysis of the change in surplus, consumer surplus in particular, where did consumer surplus go? Where did this decrease in consumer surplus go? Looking at one area after the other and analyzing it, I think it makes sense this way. And usually when I provide these explanations to support these diagrams, students seem to get it. All right, I hope this was useful. And yeah, feel free to send me a message if there is anything, if you have any question, feedback, request, anything like that. Thanks everyone. Have a good day. See you soon. Bye-bye.